What is up, Nets world? You know what it is, the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. And if you don't already, before we do anything, go to wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Go subscribe to Believe in Nets. More importantly, go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. If you don't subscribe there, if you're watching this video, we enjoy it. Like it, leave a comment, anything you guys can do to engage. It really helps to drive up this podcast as I attempt to build it up. And I just enjoy hearing feedback from fans, not only on what's happening with the Nets, but the work that I'm doing and how you guys enjoy it, how you guys think I can get better. So I really enjoy that conversation. But just recorded a really good talk with Hoopshype's Mike Scotto talking about the Nets, where they find themselves, potential trade possibilities, roster construction, a lot of things along those lines. Jordi Fernandez, we touched on. But before that, got to touch on what's happened recently. And what that is the Nets, the tanking Brooklyn Nets, or so-called tanking Brooklyn Nets. They just don't know how to tank, I guess, because they just keep winning. It's been, last time we recorded this podcast, they were 2-3. They had just beat the Memphis Grizzlies on the second night of a back-to-back, and they are 2-3 since then in their last three games. They are now 4-4 on the season. They beat the Chicago Bulls handedly and then lost to the Detroit Pistons, but then bounced back the other night with a win over the Memphis Grizzlies again on the second night of a back-to-back. And this is a team that, you know, the discourse in the NBA right now, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that they might be the top surprise of the start of this NBA season. Nobody expected this Nets team to be 4-4 through 8 games. Now, a small sample size, but they're playing competent basketball. They're playing even good complementary basketball on both ends of the floor, I would say. And for a Nets team that was projected to have a historically low win total, it was 18.5 wins on FanDuel, the lowest in 30 years for this team. They are performing so far above expectations. And I think head coach Jordi Fernandez is at the center of it. And then over these last couple wins, it really has been the Nets veterans leading this charge. Over this last one in particular, over the Grizzlies, it was Dennis Schroeder, it was Cam Johnson, it was Dorian Finney-Smith. And, you know, might be tough for some Nets fans to stomach guys who are veterans who aren't going to be in this team's future and potentially could be traded ahead of this deadline, something I'm going to touch on later, leading the team to wins early on in the year. But if you're looking at it from a positive, these guys are building trade value at least right now because they're playing a very high-level basketball. Dennis Schroeder, I think, had one bad game in the Pistons loss, but has just continued to look like, through 8 games, one of the best point guards in the NBA. He's averaging 20 points and 7 assists on over 50% shooting, just playing elite basketball, leading this team on both ends of the floor as an organizer, as a point-of-attack defender, just doing all of it. Cam Johnson has performed very well. This last game in particular was his best of the season at 20 points on 8 of 11 shooting from the field and 3 of 4 from 3. Over Brooklyn's last 5 games, Cam Johnson, 18.8 points on 44% shooting from 3. So 44% from 3, that's the NBA's 6th best mark among 27 players attempting 8 or more threes per game over the last 5 games. So he's shooting it like one of the best players in the NBA over this recent stretch. Dorian Finney-Smith really broke out of some extended struggles, was struggling big time, had 17 points on 5 of 8 shooting from 3 against Memphis, and more importantly, hit a 3 with a minute remaining to put this game ahead. It was tied to give the Nets the lead, and played very high-level defense on Jaren Jackson Jr. and switching all over the place, all that stuff that he does. And you know, the veterans are leading it. It has been those 3 guys. It wasn't Cam Thomas. Cam Thomas has struggled over these last 3-4 games. He had a really, really good performance actually against the Chicago Bulls in that win, but then was 6 of 17 against the Pistons, only had 2 assists. After that game, I talked to Jordi Fernandez, and he said that he wanted to see him when he has an off night offensively or other teams are throwing their best defender and a lot of doubles and all these things at them, which teams are, because he is the Nets' best shot creator. He wants to see Cam, respond and impact the game in other ways. He wants to see him, get involved, moving off the ball, getting involved as a creator, being more of an assist guy on those nights. And then he came back against the Memphis Grizzlies and shot 6 of 17 from the field again, but did have 6 assists. So he bounced back a little bit in that regard. But when you're talking about Cam's efficiency now in the season, Cam's at 42% from the field. He's at 31% from 3. Cam's 9 of 44 from 3 over the last 5 games. That's like 20%. So not shooting efficiently. He has been getting to the line a lot, which raised his true shooting has been boosted by that because he shot a ton of free throws over these last 5 games. But think the shot selection has a little bit of room to grow, obviously. I think a lot of those three-point struggles are a product of him taking some forced shots early in some of the shot clocks. And then, as Jordi Fernandez said, the playmaking and some of the other things needs to improve, which I think he did. He took a nice step in this Memphis game. But the bottom line is, over these last few wins, or this last win in particular, because Cam played well in the Chicago game, it was the Nets veterans leading the way in that game. And it was, as I said, Schroeder, Johnson, and Finney-Smith. And a lot of people, 4-4 through 8 games, the tank talk, is the tank in jeopardy? Where are the Nets going with this? Are they potentially going to try to get feisty and kind of, play themselves out of a top pick in the draft? It would have to take a lot for that to happen. I talked about that with Scotto, so I'm not going to get too deep into it because we really talk about why that we think that won't happen. But just on the surface level, I think the Nets are going to cool off at some point, Schroeder and some of these guys. And also just looking at the team's upcoming schedule, they're 4-4 right now over their next 8 games. They have Boston twice. They have the Knicks twice. Then they have the Cavaliers and the Pelicans. The Cavaliers are playing like one of the best teams in the league. Boston is the best team in the league, probably. The Knicks, we know what they are. They're 3-3, but a very good team. The Pelicans have some injury struggles, but it would not be entirely surprising if the Nets come out of that stretch 0-8. So we'll see how this all plays out, but the Nets are making things interesting out of the gate for the whole NBA community, for the Nets community, for people who wanted the tank, for people who want them to be competitive, people looking at Cam Thomas, the veterans, Jordi Fernandez, all of it. A lot of interesting storylines surrounding it and a lot of things that I think questions that it's bringing up. And I broke all of that down and answered all those questions with Scotto. Really hope you guys enjoy that talk after a quick break. And I'm joined now by Hoopshype's Michael Scotto, a recurring guest on this podcast. Scotto, about 8 games into the NBA season. How you feeling, man?
I'm feeling all right. I'd like to think certainly for the Brooklyn Nets, they're feeling pretty good about their start to the season as well, certainly defying some expectations thus far, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But always good to see you in the media room, brother, and then happy to join you on your pod for this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's up for debate how the Nets are feeling about their start of the season. I mean, I think some Nets fans are feeling good. Some aren't feeling so good. The organization, who knows? But obviously, I did an intro to this and went through what's gone down. But the Nets 4-4 to start the year. A team that was projected, I think, to have an 18.5 win total entering the season. So historically low expectations. And it's seeding them thus far under first-time NBA head coach Jordi Fernandez. So, Scotto, you're a guy who's been around the Nets for a long time. You've kind of seen this whole journey since coming to Brooklyn. They pivot to this rebuild, and it hasn't been what people expected through 8 games. So, to you, what's been the most surprising part of the Nets' hot start so far this season?
Well, it's funny, Erik. I remember seeing Jordi Fernandez out in Las Vegas when he was coaching the Canadian national team before they went overseas for the Olympics, and Jordi, one of the first things he said to me was, "I think we've got a pretty good team." And I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, "You do?" Like, I mean, I know that I was only teasing him. I mean, I expected a coach to say that, but I joked with him and I said, "Well, look, I mean, they're starting to rebuild, and they were going to get their own pick back, and it was clear that it was the early stages of a rebuild. I mean, I certainly expected him to do well. I know some compare him to Kenny Atkinson 2.0. They have different styles, certainly, but the emphasis on that was they were both brought in to essentially build up a culture and get things back on track. So, simply put, Erik, Jordi Fernandez didn't get the memo that the Nets are supposed to be tanking in the eyes of other people around the league. And one of the reasons for that, to your point about the biggest surprise, I think Dennis Schroeder's played extremely well to start the season, and his play at the point guard position has really been a table setter for the Nets. Certainly, Jordi Fernandez has talked about him being a leader in the locker room, and I think he said if you Google locker room leader or something, you'd find a picture of Dennis Schroeder, and there may or may not have been some AI editing on the Brooklyn Nets Twitter account, but I got a kick out of it for sure. But he's, in all seriousness, Dennis Schroeder's played great. And I certainly think for a guy that's on an expiring contract, while he has made it clear that he would like to stay here because he's certainly getting a chance to play and having a large role. If you're a team that's a playoff caliber team and you're in need of a point guard of some kind, whether it's a high-end backup or maybe you need a spot start or something like that, you could look to the Nets and Dennis Schroeder as an option down the line as we look ahead towards the trade deadline.
Definitely. Schroeder's a guy who, just a really interesting story. I've talked about him in my last 2 episodes because he's frankly not just with the Nets. He's been one of the biggest surprises in the NBA so far, I think, this season, because he's a guy who, while always, I think, has been viewed as a dependable guy and a guy who is definitely worthy of rotation minutes. He's been somewhat of a journeyman. Like the last 7 years or 7 NBA seasons, he's changed teams 7 times. So there's been a lot of movement from him. And this year, he comes out of the gate. He's playing like legitimately one of the best point guards in the league, if not the best. I mean, he's had 20 points, 7.3 assists, 51, 49, 86 shooting splits. Like that's unbelievable. Like I just wrote an article and I think there's 4 players in the NBA or 5 players in the NBA right now averaging over 19 points per game and 7 assists per game on over 45% shooting. And it's like Schroeder, LeBron James, Nikola Jokic, Cade Cunningham, and Ja Morant, I think. So that just gives you, I mean, it's only 8 games, like a small sample size, but he's playing with confidence and he's leading this Nets team to a place this early that, I don't think a lot of people really thought was in the cards. And then, that's Schroeder. Just touching on what you said with Jordi Fernandez. Like, I always think it's so interesting, and we're going to get into some trade talk and stuff. You were talking about Schroeder and some of the other Nets veterans shortly here, but I just think it's interesting, like a first-time NBA head coach coming in. Obviously, the team has extremely low expectations. They're expected to be tanking this year. But like organizations are the ones who tank, and obviously like the head coach is clued into that. But at the same time, like Jordi Fernandez is stepping in here. Like he doesn't want losses piling up on his record. Like even if it will set the team up best long term, like this is a guy that wants to come in. I'm sure he's very pleased with the discussion surrounding his name after this 4-4 start. So just like that relationship between an organization and a front office and ownership tanking and a coach and a roster, just like, how do you feel about how that plays out during an NBA season? Because it seems like the players are obviously going to play as hard as they can, or they should, because it only benefits them to play well. Right. The ownership and the general manager and the front office are clear in their mission. And it seems like the head coach sometimes is caught in the middle. So just like, how do you view that dynamic? Because this is something that plays out with a lot of NBA teams.
Look, I'll say this. Anytime I've talked to Jordi Fernandez, Sean Marks, and whatnot, there is alignment, I think, from top to bottom. Certainly, I think they are pleasantly a surprise at this point, beating the Milwaukee Bucks, the Memphis Grizzlies, among certain teams to this point. Pretty good teams. And for the Nets, Sean Marks talked about it before the year. It's all about finding the future Nets. And so Cam Thomas is trying to round out his game a little bit more as a guy that can be more efficient as a scorer, continue to grow and be more efficient, and be a playmaker. A guy like Zaire Williams, for example, who never really was able to get a chance in Memphis due to their situation, has an opportunity and has come into Brooklyn and has thrived off the bench thus far and shown that he can be an NBA rotation player. He had the talent coming into the league, but you're seeing things along those lines. So for Jordi, first off, I mean, he's a guy that came into the league. And I know a lot of people say, well, a first-year head coach has a learning curve. But this guy's been a G League head coach. He coached the Canadian national team. He's been an associate head coach on a successful team with the Sacramento Kings. And from what I've heard from people, he had a lot to do with their offense there and some of the systems that they ran. So he's bringing that here to Brooklyn and has brought it effectively.
You're saying the systems that they ran in Sacramento, you're saying? Offensive systems there.
From NBA scouts I've spoken to who saw the Kings previously and are now seeing the Nets. Yes, that's what they've said. And so other than that, also I would say just for this team in general, you mentioned about players don't come to a game trying to lose. You've got a lot of guys on this team that are also playing for a contract going forward for themselves, or if they're going to get traded to show that they have high value. I think all of this has gelled. And in one respect, in that regard, it's a little like the Kenny Atkinson 6-seed Nets when all those guys had their own futures to worry about as well, but they banded together and all realized that the collective sum doing well is going to benefit them all individually. Now, with that said, Erik, I think organizationally, they are going to have to make a decision. When you trade Mikal Bridges, you're clearly going in the direction of a rebuild. And I would say to you that if you're going to be hovering around this range now where you're 500 or you're not really bad, but you're not really good, I don't think that serves much of a purpose for the long term. So could I see a world where the Nets almost do what the Utah Jazz did previously and kind of look to be more sellers at the deadline? It's possible. The question is going to be, who are the buyers in the market? I think around the league, and I've talked with executives about this to start the year, there could be a number of teams that are going to be sellers. Mm-hmm. But who are the buyers? The Nets have a lot of wing players that could be coveted. Dennis Schroeder as a point guard option for teams. And so, Dorian Smith, et cetera. Bojan Bogdanovic, if he can come back and show he's healthy, maybe a contender takes a flyer on him as an off-the-bench guy. A lot of different variables. If you need a backup center, Day'Ron Sharpe, who will be eligible for restricted free agency and you can control going into the summer. A lot of variables at play for the Nets going forward.
Dare I say Cam Thomas?
Here's the thing, Erik, with Cam Thomas. I think the narrative on Cam Thomas has changed in a positive direction compared to where it was in the beginning. In the beginning, it was, he's just a scorer and you can't win with this guy. That was the narrative on him, right? And now I've spoken to teams that have good records. And while Cam Thomas on this team may average 25 points because they need him to score. They don't have a lot of guys that can create off the dribble and get their own shot. If you put Cam Thomas on a playoff caliber team or a team that's trying to contend for a championship, there's a world where if he is mentally bought in, some around the league think that he can be on a championship caliber or high playoff caliber team, a Lou Williams or a Jamal Crawford. Now, I think for the Nets, Cam Thomas has the runway to really show what he can be in this league this season. And that was kind of the thesis of when I asked him during media day if he thought he had anything to prove. And I know he said at the time he didn't think he really needed to prove anything because he's shown that he can score and do things over his time here. But what I meant by that question was almost in terms of not only the narrative, but like, can you be a front-end starter on a high winning ball club? And for the Nets, I mean, he's fighting behind the eight ball because they're not designed to be a high win team this year. They're not. They didn't trade for their own pick, Erik, to be good. That would defy the logic. So again, that's why when everybody say to me about like kind of where they are and expectations, they're outperforming their expectations for now. But big picture, long term, it's good in the sense. I know you asked me too about Nets fans. Well, some are happy, some are sad. I see the timeline. I get it. But I would say to the Nets fans that are watching this, if you have guys playing well like Dennis Schroeder and, Cam Johnson shot the ball really well. And last year he dealt with injuries. He's had a bounce back year. If your guys that are in trade rumors and trade speculation are playing well, that can only help because you're upping their value. And it's the negative, I think, would be, again, if they stay hovering around this kind of 500 mark throughout the year, because then I feel like it defeated the purpose of trading Mikal Bridges and the direction that you thought you were going to take when you reacquired your own first-round picks in a loaded draft, not only this year, Erik, but in the next year as well. You talk to any GM, executive, scout, you name it. They're all in agreement that there are guys that could be high-level players and really impact an organization going forward in these drafts to come in the next 2 years.
Yeah, and that's what Sean Marks admitted this much, that, when we talked to him after he made the Bridges trade, that he said flat out the strength of the 2025 and 2026 draft classes played a strong role in this decision. Now, you're talking about it's only a good thing if these guys who are in trade rumors are playing really well. They're, raising their value. I think the question becomes, at what point does it get to a point where the Nets are winning too many games and they're hurting their draft position as opposed to these guys increasing their trade value, when I think the increase in that trade value will ultimately pale in comparison to the prospect of them getting, one of those top players in the 2025 draft. So that's kind of the back and forth that they're grappling with. And it ties into the next thing that I want to talk about. I want to go back to Cam Thomas, because what you said, actually, we'll touch on Cam Thomas when we get into.
It's always Cam Thomas time.
Yeah, we'll get into Cam Thomas when I want to talk about the Nets veterans and trade possibilities and all that, and maybe we'll tie Cam Thomas into that situation. But what I was just saying, the grappling with these guys increasing their trade value versus hurting the Nets draft position, and you said that Nets management and Jordi Fernandez, at head coach, are aligned in messaging and the goal here, which I would hope so. The question that I have a personal answer to, but I want to hear your take or a personal opinion on, is the Nets are 4-4 right now. Let's say they hold on to these guys as we're approaching the trade deadline. They're playing really good basketball. Is there a scenario where if they continue to play really good basketball, which I think the jury's out on how realistic that is based on the upcoming schedule, but is there a scenario you think where this could actually lead them to go in another direction and say, hey, like maybe we can be a back end playoff team as opposed to the tank, which is the plan? Like, I have my own opinion on this or what they should do, but what's your take on that?
Nah.
Okay.
I don't. Simply put, I don't, because there's too much long-term upside. And let me say one thing, Erik, about the whole tanking thing. In the NBA now, pretty much if you even have a bottom 5 record, you have a shot. You don't need to be the worst team.
Yeah. It helps to be the worst team, though, because that raises the floor of your pick. But it's not the end-all, be-all. I get what you're saying.
Yeah, but how did that go for the Detroit Pistons?
I know. I knew you were going to. I'm just saying, though.
No. And by the way, that's not just me. That's NBA executives and teams, because you look like a genius, and they've all said this to me. You look like a genius when you win the lottery, but if you don't and you fall back and you had a miserable season, it's just another heavy-handed weight on your shoulders that you have to handle going into the following offseason, and it's a bad look for an organization. I think the Nets, let me say this, right now they're winning a lot on effort. Okay, You look at the talent, and the reality is there are more talented teams in them. They're winning on effort. I think eventually
there's more high-end talented teams, I'd say, but the Nets are actually a pretty deep team given what people think of them. Like they have
a lot of good role players on teams. Yeah. But and the summation of those parts is helping now. But I mean, big picture again, I think now, once you made the Mikal Bridges trade, you chose a clear direction. And while these guys are certainly outperforming now, it just reminds me a little bit of the Will Hardy situation with Utah years ago, where they've identified Jordi Fernandez is a really good coach. It's clear. Yeah. And I think now that you have that key piece to the puzzle, maybe you can then look towards the offseason and see, all right, do we need to hasten the rebuild a little bit? I don't think so. I don't think they're there yet at all. But it's not a bad problem to have this situation. And I got to say, I think you kind of asked me more or less if Cam Thomas could be a trade candidate. I don't necessarily see that.
Okay.
If that was kind of what you were implying.
Yeah, hold off on that.
I don't see that.
Okay. I want to just touch on that a little bit more after this, but yeah, I mean, what we were just talking about, you said, no, you don't think there's a scenario where they could lean into this and try to be a competitive team. And personally, I don't either, because I think in the NBA now, if they had, like, if this was still with the Mikal Bridges and they had him and it was that kind of deal where they could maybe talk themselves into, we get a star next to this guy, but that's just not the infrastructure. Like you said, as soon as they traded Mikal Bridges, it was, we're going in this direction. And I think they fully recognize the importance of landing a pick. Now, a top pick. Now, the question is, will there be a lot of urgency and importance? And, if they are winning more games as these next 2-3 weeks into the next month go on, will there be urgency to maybe trade some of these veterans earlier than maybe they would have expected. Maybe they were planning to trade these guys at the trade deadline. Personally, that's what I think. When all of the free agents who were signed this past offseason become available at like January 15th, that's like the start of trade season. But maybe there's urgency before that if they keep winning these games. So I think we're both in agreement, as I think most NBA people are, that they are committed to this tank. This start throws an interesting wrinkle in it, and whether or not some of these guys could be traded earlier. And, I really want to talk about some trade stuff. And obviously, let's get the Cam Thomas thing out of the way here first, because I think it's just an interesting question, because Cam Thomas, I think a lot of Nets fans are obviously excited about what he can be, but I do think that there's fair questions about how he's viewed in the eyes of the organization based on their hesitancy to put him into the rotation in the, early on in his tenure. And that the first 2 years you can say, hey, they had Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. He wasn't exactly a fit as a role player with that group, whatever. But for me, once they traded Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving at the 2023 trade deadline, in the second half of the year, they brought all these other guys like Dinwiddie, Bridges, Johnson, Finney-Smith in. After they made that deal, Cam Thomas was still glued to the bench the second half of that season, even during a playoff series against the Philadelphia 76ers, where they desperately needed scoring. He barely played. So to me, that drew a little bit of an image of how they felt about him. He was still coming off the bench at the start of last season, had his minutes fluctuate, and his role was just not solidified. This year it is. So, but I'm curious, for that reason, do you think that there's a possibility, because he's due for a contract next year, that NBA takes about where that contract's going to land are all over the spectrum?
I'm going to give you a line from a certain TV show. You know what they say about the old days? They the old days.
I don't know that show. Well, what show is that?
Pull it on YouTube. But it's a winner. Okay. And I'm sure some of your listeners know. But I would say big picture, to me, that's all well and good in the past. It could stay there because Jordi Fernandez believes in Cam Thomas and his, quote, superpowers of scoring. I'm not saying he's out there in a Mighty Morphin Power Ranger outfit, but the guy certainly knows how to score the ball, and the whole league knows it. Erik, one thing I do think is important to note about Cam Thomas, actually I'd say it's very important. Joe Tsai likes the guy a lot. He's a fan.
Okay.
So I think when your owner's a fan of a guy, and you saw this in Utah with Ryan Smith, with Jordan Clarkson, they stay.
Okay.
Funny how that works out, right? So I'm going to venture to say that he stays, especially through a trade deadline, because if you're the Nets, he'd be going into restricted free agency. You have a lot of leverage. We've just seen it around the league. Restricted free agency is tough on the incumbent free agent. And if you're a team around the league, there's not a ton of cap space out there right now. And
ironically, the Nets have all the cap space next year.
Well, isn't that the most ironic thing? Yes. Yeah. And so they're going to bid on themselves. They have all the leverage. And I think in this instance, there's the way he's playing right now. This is a guy that's averaging 25 plus. Easy. Like he predicted he would. It's there. I think the question is, can he get to, 4.5, 5 assists and whatnot, and continue to round out his game and help the team try to win, get to the free throw line more, continue to try to be more efficient with Jordi Fernandez. And I think he stays. But there's plenty of other guys we can talk about. There's a Christmas list of Brooklyn Nets that could be on the trade market. And I will certainly be writing about this coming up relatively soon.
Everybody's looking forward to that, and they're going to get a little sneak preview because we're going to talk about it here. Last thing I'm just curious about on Cam Thomas, I agree with you. I think that the Nets will be in a good position to lock him in on a reasonable number where at least like they can see what they have, and it could be a lower risk, higher upside, because they lock him up on a reasonable number and then he does take another step. It looks good. If not, they had all this cap space that they needed to spend anyway, as long as it's not, an egregious
The one thing about the Nets, I would say, flexibility-wise, you're going to want to sign him to a number that you feel like you can move him eventually if you have to.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
If you have to.
And that ties into my question right now, which the fact that he's on an expiring contract might complicate the answer that you would have to this question. But you just said there's contenders around the league who would view him, if they traded for him this year could be like that six-man scoring punch off the bench. Like we've heard the Lou Williams, Jordan Clarkson comparisons, like all that. He's a guy who, like, that obviously I think is not the role that Cam wants to play. So there would be questions about his buy-in in that scenario. But if he was in that situation, he's a guy who could come in off the bench and like swing a playoff game or two and potentially swing a series with his scoring ability. And I think that would only benefit him, obviously. So in that hypothetical, if he were on the market, I'm just curious, like, is there a value that you think you could peg on him? Like how would those contending teams that you've said view him in that light? Would they be able to give up anything significant for him in a deal?
I'm going to answer this both for Cam and in general. If the Nets are making trades, it's all about future draft capital.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. Now, again, I really don't think Cam Thomas is going anywhere. I really don't.
Okay.
But if he was, you'd have to be getting – he's at a low price figure. I don't think you'd – unless it's another rookie scale guy and future picks. I don't see it overall. And we could talk about plenty of other guys. I really don't see – I don't see Cam going anywhere. I would be surprised if Cam was moved before the deadline at this point.
Yeah, as would I. I was just curious because I do think there's a world where some contenders could have interest or talk themselves into it. And even though I don't think he's going to get moved, I was just curious. His value is such an interesting thing to talk about because so many people have so many different opinions on it, whether it's as a trade asset or whether it's what he's going to get on his next contract. I think it's just an interesting conversation. I think it's one that we'll continue to have just about potentially his next contract value as the season goes on, because the Nets are going to be in a position where they're going to have to be at the negotiating table. But moving on to the guys who are likely, I think, to be traded or are the prime candidates. I think obviously we know the suspects are. It's Cam Johnson, Dennis Schroeder, Dorian Finney-Smith. I'm going to leave Bojan Bogdanovic out of this conversation because we have no idea when he's going to play basketball again because they just don't have an update on him. So out of those three guys, I want to talk about specific scenarios and throw some hypotheticals at you, but who do you think out of those three guys has the most trade value in your eyes?
Well, I will say this. I won't neglect Bojan Bogdanovic because I do think they're going to want to bring him back before the trade deadline, play him a little, and see if there's a world where he can be moved. And maybe get like a second-round pick back or something. But the other three guys, I'll start with Cam Johnson. Cam has a descending contract, I believe, going forward.
Yeah, he does.
Shot the ball well as a stretch four. Professional guy. You know, around the league that if you're going to probably try to get Cam Thomas, it would cost, I would say, a first-round pick of some kind.
Cam Johnson, you're saying? Correct,
Cam Johnson. And I'm not sure if other teams are going to meet that asking price, but I think there's at least a consensus that that's what it would take as of now, at least. And for Cam, because he's locked up for the next few years, and it's, again, a descending contract. He's shooting the ball well, and teams around the league always need shooting. So for Dennis Schroeder, I think it's a little more complicated because he's going to be an unrestricted free agent after this season. And for Dennis, if it's going to be a rental, maybe can you get 2 second-round picks for him if he's a guy that a playoff caliber team thinks can swing the needle towards a championship? There's a world where maybe that happens, I think. Time will tell, but it's a possibility. And third guy, who's the third guy you're saying?
Dorian Finney-Smith.
Dorian Finney-Smith is a guy that 3-and-D guy, can play the wing, the 4. He's guarded 5s at times.
Guards
Great
everybody.
locker room guy. Yeah, the Nets have held on to him more than people thought they would. And I think what's interesting about Dorian is he's got a player option for next season. So depending on if he's moved to a team, he can opt into that and then maybe work out an extension going forward or a new deal going into free agency, depending on how he's playing for the season. Time will tell on all that. But for Dorian, it's almost similar to Schroeder a little bit. You can get, I would say, multiple second-round picks. Now, the quality of those picks is always up for the air. I'm talking about in general. So I would venture that for now. at this point. And, again, we'll have to see coming up if they feel the need to do it. But he is well liked in that locker room, and he's viewed as a good locker room leader. So for the Nets, again, people thought that he would have been moved a long time ago. And even the day that they got Dorian Finney-Smith in the Kyrie Irving trade, there was talk of the 2 first-round picks. I don't remember the quality of them at this point because we're pretty far removed from them, but or if they, protected and whatnot. But now the further you get into a contract, and the older a player gets, obviously the value shifts a little bit. So for him, as of this very moment, I think multiple second-round picks is a fair assessment, depending on where the picks would be or any protections of that kind for him.
I'm in agreement with, I think, those assessments. For, I think it's clear that Cam has the most value out of the group in terms of him being locked under contract for 2 seasons after this one. He's the youngest. He's 28 years old. The other 2 guys are 30. And I think that you're talking about trying to get first-round pick value for him. I think some people maybe would have thought that that's not going to happen. If he keeps playing like he is and he keeps playing well and he stays healthy, that's the most important thing.
Yep.
I think that a 6'8" guy who can guard competently across multiple positions and shoots near 40% from 3 on high volume as he has throughout his career, that's definitely a type of player that a lot of contenders can talk themselves into, especially if you're giving up what might be a late first-round pick in some of these scenarios. So I think that that's a scenario. I could really see that playing out for him. As it gets to Dennis and Dorian, I think I agree with what you said about might be like more towards the line of multiple seconds, because obviously you said those guys are expiring contracts. Dorian has the player option. Like, I think the Nets did a similar type thing with Royce O'Neal, like the way we saw that play out. They held him until he was expiring, till the trade deadline in the final year of his contract. They ended up moving him. They got 3 second-round picks and salary fillers. So, like,
pretty
they
good.
moved Dorian. I think that could be along the lines of what it gets. I think it gets interesting if you start looking at some teams and maybe could you try to package Dorian and Dennis? Like, it starts getting up there in money. That starts to become like $27 million between the two of them.
It's funny you mentioned that combo. I'm just laughing because we were sitting, I won't say who the representative was from another team, but I was sitting with a couple people at the media room table in Barclays, and the joke was, would a team like, maybe the Milwaukee Bucks, who could use some bench depth, look at Dennis Schroeder and Dorian Finney-Smith and maybe try to carve something out there. Just joking around about it. So when you brought up the package of the two of them, certainly an interesting and plausible scenario. A lot of different combinations for the Nets and optionality for sure.
Yeah, and the thing that makes that package difficult for some of these teams, like you just said, the Bucks, the Lakers are the team I'm going to talk about that I think a lot of people have thrown around. But because of the new apron rules in the new CBA, teams that are over the first or second apron have to match that salary altogether in a trade. Like, you have to match the amount of salary you're taking in, the same as what you're sending out. Whereas if you're under that first apron, you only have to send out a percentage of that salary. So, like, if you're trying to trade Dennis and Dorian, that gets to up near $27 million between the two of them. And you're talking about the Bucks, like, they just don't really have that salary unless they're trading one of the core pieces of their team. Like, it becomes difficult in that regard for a lot of teams. But I do want to get into some hypotheticals and just have some fun and throw some fake trades around, because I think people really like this stuff. And these are guys that the Nets are going to move or going to be in discussions to move, it seems like. So a few teams that I just wanted to touch on and get your opinions on some of these deals. I think that the Orlando Magic, I think, are an interesting team for several of these guys. In particular, I think they've been brought up for Dennis Schroeder for obvious reasons. He's got the German national team connection to Franz and Mo Wagner. Like, they have the chemistry there. They are a team that last year in the first round of the playoffs did not get a lot of production out of their either like Jalen Suggs or Cole Anthony, but Cole Anthony at reserve point guard particularly struggled in that series and hasn't been off to a great start this year. So if you're talking about a guy like Dennis, could you see him maybe being a fit there? And something along the lines of if they're moving off a guy like Cole Anthony, you give up Cole Anthony and say one of their younger players who was a high pick recently, like a Jet Howard or something like that, a Cole Anthony and a Jet Howard for Dennis Schroeder, if you're not giving up draft compensation. I think that's a trade that makes them better, and I think it does make some sense for both sides. I mean, I don't know how the Nets feel about Cole Anthony, but he is 24 years old, and Jet Howard, recent draft pick. So what do you think about it?
You're picking up the years on Cole Anthony's extension then if you do that, and it would depend on how much the Nets valued Jet Howard, who, of course, is the son of Nets assistant coach Juwan Howard. I get how at least there's some form of plausibility for that because of the Dennis Schroeder German national team connection with the Wagner brothers. However, I would say Orlando, for the most part, values continuity in their young core. So I don't know if they would trade for a guy that's almost a hired gun unless they felt like he was going to be a part of them long term. And when you've got Anthony,
what do you mean by hired gun? Do you mean like a ball handler or what's?
No, what I mean by a hired gun is like just a rental.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. So you're saying they're trying to build long-term continuity.
Yeah,
they could re-sign Dennis though. I mean, it's not like
they could. But to that point, they've got Jalen Suggs, Anthony Black. They've got young guards, and I guess what's that?
Anthony Black. That was if they're high on him, that's where this kind of falls apart. But keep going.
Well, they are. They took him pretty high.
There you go. I mean,
all right. Not to pour water on the fire, but. I know they're high on him.
Okay.
I think he's going to be a defensive stud, and offensively is obviously where he has to improve. But they're built around defense.
Yeah, Orlando's a team that I thought just was interesting because they do have some tradable draft picks. They have some young players, and they have a lot of mid-sized contracts to be able to match salaries in these deals. So they're really a team that could be in play for any of the Nets veterans. Those three guys. Cam Johnson is another guy who I think is interesting because Orlando obviously has Paolo Banchero. They have Franz, two guys who aren't known for their three-point shooting, although they can shoot. And it's been well documented that last season they had a deficit of shooting around those guys. They tried to address that this offseason, bringing in Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. But in the NBA, I think a lot of times teams think you can never have enough shooting. So if you talk about a guy like Cam Johnson, who is a very high-level shooter who would offer a pretty good fit there because he's a seamless fit on a lot of teams just because of the role that he plays. They have ways that they could make a deal like that work also. And I was looking at, they have three mid-sized tradable salaries between Cole Anthony, Gary Harris, Goga Batadze. Gary Harris can't be traded until January 15th, but those three guys are three tradable salaries. So if you're talking about, like I said, Cole Anthony, Gary Harris, Goga Batadze, two of those three guys get you to Cam's money-wise to match the deal. And then they have Denver's first-round pick in this year's draft, which could end up looking better than some people thought. But, something along those lines for Cam Johnson, I thought could be a package that could make sense. Say like a Cole Anthony, Gary Harris, that Denver first for Cam Johnson. That works for them.
Here's my thing, Erik. This is what I'd say on Cam Johnson overall on his trade prospects. If the Nets feel like they are going to substantially get better long-term with future draft pick compensation, then I think there's a world where Cam Johnson gets moved. But the reality is they like him as a person. They like him as a player. Unless Cam Johnson goes to the Nets and says, I want out, I don't think there's this over-emphasis on trying to move him. It's kind of, if it happens, it happens. And if it's only to their liking is how I would frame it.
Yeah, I understand that. I did want to say before that because I think it's self-explanatory that because Cam has 2 years left on his contract, there's the least urgency to move him out of these three guys. But Cam has looked good to start the season. And if we get to a point where we're approaching the trade deadline and Cam is healthy, most importantly, and playing well, shooting the ball at a high level, I do think at that point, I mean, do you really want to gamble and hold on to him, risk him getting hurt, risk him potentially his play declining? Like at that point, that's where I feel like there might not be, they don't have to trade him, but at that juncture, if he's healthy and he's playing well, I don't see why there's a reason why you wouldn't unless there just isn't a market for him. And I think that, I mean, you didn't give me an answer on that deal. How do you feel about that package? I said Cole Anthony, Gary Harris, and Denver's 2025 first for Cam. Like, do you think that's a reasonable price?
I don't think it moves the needle because it's like, again,
You don't think it moves the needle for Orlando? You don't think it moves the needle?
I don't think it moves the needle for the Nets because
really,
I don't think so because
Denver's
20.
It's
so what are you going to get?
20.
You're going to get a pick 25 or later. I mean, I guess you could, but
I mean, what are you expecting for Cam Johnson? That's like the question. They're expecting a real first for him?
I mean, I'm sure they would try to push for a little higher than that if they can, maybe closer to top 20. We're talking semantics, but again, I don't think like the Nets would be like itching to necessarily go for Cole Anthony's money there. You know, Gary Harris or whatever is expiring.
I got to check.
That's where I'm at.
No, I understand that because Sean Marks has their future cap space and flexibility has been something that Sean Marks has talked about a lot. I mean, Cole's on a smaller number. I mean, it could also be Gary Harris and Goga Batadze plus that draft pick, which Goga's on a little bit less money.
Orlando likes Goga Batadze a lot.
They've got 3 centers though that they like to play. I mean, Wendell Carter Jr. has like some kind of plantar fasciitis deal, so I don't know how that. I have heard from other people also though that they like Goga, so who knows? But they do have 3 centers, so that's where that was where that thought process was coming from. But all right, I'll say I think there's possibilities with Orlando. We'll see. Another team I want to talk about, the Cleveland Cavaliers. I think there are some interesting possibilities, and I think this is something that you reported on with a potential sign and trade. They've since signed Isaac Okoro, but
they can't be traded. Conversations about Isaac Okoro and Dorian Finney-Smith.
Yeah, he can't be traded. He can't be traded until January 15th now. But we get to that point. I mean, Okoro for Finney-Smith straight up. No, not even any draft picks. I mean, you're kind of just getting a different player, but a similar player at a younger age.
I don't know if Cleveland would do that though, because for the value they've got him as a younger guy long term, that's one of the reasons why they decided to just keep Okoro. And a lot of teams were wondering with Cleveland, would they be willing to pay a luxury tax to keep Okoro? I do think they can make some smaller moves around the edge to duck the luxury tax. But I don't know if moving Okoro right now is the piece.
Okay. And then Cam Johnson, another guy, though. They have Caris LeVert there, a guy who has done some good things for them, but is not three-point shot has not developed like the Nets hoped it would since, he was with them and since he's since moved on. It just the three-point shot hasn't gotten there, and they're looking for more floor spacing around their guard duo and their big man duo. Caris LeVert and a minimum gets you money-wise to Cam Johnson. Now, the problem is with draft picks, the Cavs only have one tradable first-round pick left, and it's their 2031 first. And who knows where that's going to be. And I think that's pretty scary to trade when you don't know what Donovan Mitchell could look like down the line in the whole situation. So
yeah, but if you're the Nets,
but
if you're the Nets, it's a dart throw that could be really important, I think.
Yeah. So Caris and a minimum plus that 2031 first. Do you think there's anything there that both sides could, get into some talks on that?
I mean, the Nets have certainly brought back guys from the past culture like they did with Dinwiddie. I know Sean's always liked Caris. Kenny Atkinson and Caris have a great relationship still. And I would say is that's a hypothetical trade that I think is at least plausible.
Yeah, I mean, that's what all these are. I'm just curious. I just want to throw some of these things around there because I get
the logic behind it for both.
I have, and that's it isn't necessarily easy, but that's what I've tried to do just throughout the offseason when I was just curious. I was looking around the league for deals for some of these guys, and it isn't what you just said. It isn't easy to always find deals for guys like Cam and Dorian where you say that makes sense for both sides. So when I have found a few, I've gotten a little eager to share them. So just having a little having a little fun on the trade machine. But
fun talking shop about it for sure. I get it.
Next, another team and just a player that I was curious about was the Indiana Pacers and Jarris Walker. Because he's a guy who the Nets strategy has been obvious through their last rebuild and this one. They like to take swings on these high upside reclamation projects, which makes sense with where they're at. So if you talk about the Pacers and Jarris Walker, a guy who they picked in the top 10, I don't remember, I think maybe 8th, but has not been able to crack their rotation so far with them.
Yeah.
Jarris Walker, the Pacers obviously made an Eastern Conference Finals run last year. They're trying to be a competitive team, and the East looks pretty vulnerable in some areas this year. Jarris Walker and a minimum for Dorian Finney-Smith. The Nets get a high upside player in Jarris Walker. The Pacers are able to turn a guy who hasn't been in their rotation into a seasoned veteran who has played playoff minutes and been productive in the playoffs. What do you think there?
I think Dorian's an interesting name. Jarris, I mean, I think they would want more for Jarris just because of where they took him so high. And now, given the injury to Isaiah Jackson and
Wiseman too,
and for James Wiseman, I do think there should be a path where they're going to play him more. And they've had internal conversations about that, about playing him more, quite frankly. So I think for now he's going to get the benefit of the doubt, and then you see by the trade deadline. I mean, they're looking now for maybe some more stopgap minimum kind of guys for now. Long term, depending where they're at in the standings, I think then that thinking could shift. But time's going to tell on that. We'll have to revisit that in a few months. But I will say from a Nets perspective, that makes total sense to have interest in a guy like Jarris Walker. It fits the timeline. It fits their prototype.
Okay. Another team, Houston Rockets. This one I might be getting a little too funky, a little too many names thrown in here, but they are a team that I think I've heard or read that they had interest in Cam Johnson in the past. I don't remember which transaction cycle it was, but they have some tradable salaries. And if you look at, they also have the Nets 2027 first round pick swap, which I think could be interesting depending on how fast this rebuild goes. If you're talking about tradable salaries, I was just trying to find a deal that the money works. And you got Jayshawn Tate, Jeff Green, and Aaron Holiday, say for Cam Johnson and Shake Milton. The money works that way. And then the Rockets just amend the swap on the 2027 Nets first rounder. Now, I think the Nets want a first rounder versus not getting anything, but getting rid of that swap could have some value and gives you a lot more optionality in how you want to play the rebuild out. So I think that could be something interesting there.
Interesting take. For the longest time, I think a lot of people around the league felt that all those contracts that the Rockets had would be used to try to get a star, a high-level wing player. Though I would say I think more people thought it would be kind of a 3. And I think a Cam is more of a 4 to space the floor offensively, even though defensively I know sometimes he has to be a better rebounder and whatnot. But previously, yes, the Rockets have had interest in Cam Johnson previously, but I think that was more when he was with the Suns. I would say now nothing about his game has changed. I think it's just it would have to be dependent upon other things they have. Would he be like somebody on their board? Yeah, I could see that. But is he the highest guy on the board? Probably not.
Okay. Couple more quick ones, and then we'll get out of here. I thought the Spurs maybe could be an interesting team because I think they're a team that just has a surplus of draft picks, and they have a sense of urgency to, I think, improve around Victor Wembanyama in the near future. Yeah. And it was just an easy deal that was like 1-for-1 that I thought was simple. Just Harrison Barnes, they kind of got him as a throw-in for helping facilitate that DeMar DeRozan sign-in trade. And then you just flip him for Cam Johnson. They have future draft picks. Like they have Dallas's 2030 first. So they get a guy who's 4 years younger than Harrison Barnes. He's under contract for 2 more years after this, a floor spacer around Wemby and something like that. Like I don't know, like if the Spurs would have urgency to get a deal like that done, but I thought it's something that there is a logic that you could follow there.
You said it. I could see the logic behind that. Victor makes up for a lot of defense there, certainly. So it's a good combo. He spaces the floor for Victor. Young would fit still young enough where he would fit the timeline, but also a veteran and a good locker room guy that they would value. I think something hypothetically like that, as you proposed, would depend on how the Nets feel about Harrison Barnes going forward. And if he's a vet I mean, he's a good veteran locker room guy. I've never heard anything otherwise. It's just, is that where you want to have your money, and would it be tied up for a little bit?
Yeah, he also only has one more year on his contract after this, and I guess it just depends on would Spurs value Cam Johnson at a future first-round pick or something like that. And so that's their last team I want to talk about before I let you get out of here is just the Los Angeles Lakers, because I feel like they're a team that they're trying to get better and just stay competitive around LeBron James, obviously. And they're a team that has been linked to the Nets for Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith in the past. They also obviously have history with Dennis Schroeder being there, a guy who did have some success there. Now, the Lakers, these deals get complicated with the Lakers, and I haven't given them too much thought because they're one of these first apron teams where they have to match the money, completely. And then they they're only like big tradable contracts are D'Angelo Russell and Rui Hachimura, but there's been smoke around that in the past. So just tying all these hypothetical trade scenarios out, and I appreciate you bearing with me. Just you see anything?
I just feel like if the Lakers were going to make a move with the Nets, it would have happened last year.
Okay.
I mean, that would have been my thought. Like, there was enough smoke around it, and if it didn't happen then. Now, if you're telling me about Dennis Schroeder, I guess that's a different conversation because the Nets didn't, have – I don't think the Nets had Schroeder by the time they were, talking about, like, Dorian Finney-Smith and whatnot with the Lakers. And it's just, my thing is always, if those talks happen and they don't come to fruition and it's a rotation guy, I'm always of the mindset that the time passed. If it's a star, like the way that the Knicks circled Karl Towns for years, I never said to myself, that interest has waned. No, they just couldn't get it done. Until now. So for the Lakers, I don't think they've been circling the Nets with this urgency to try to get some of their rotation guys. I feel like it would have happened by now if it was going to.
That's fair. And I haven't just the machinations of how a deal would work there. I think the Nets would obviously, like you said, they'd be looking for draft picks. The Lakers have kind of been hoarding their future.
They have resisted that. They have resisted Austin Reeves in trades.
So are they going to trade? Are they going to trade D'Lo or Rui Hachimura plus a first-round pick to get back like a Cam Johnson or a Dorian Finney-Smith or a Dennis Schroeder or a combination? I'm just not sure where that leaves them. And then they're burning their, last of their future first-round picks. So
exactly. And I guess if you're going to say who's the top trade candidate theoretically for the Lakers, D'Angelo Russell would be the guy. Given his expiring contract.
We're just talking about former Nets on here. That's all we're doing. We're just trying to get. It
always comes back to the it's funny. And, by the way, you got Kenny Atkinson in Cleveland through this point, looking like Coach of the Year candidate. It always comes back.
And the Nets will be in Cleveland to face Atkinson on Saturday, I think that is. So we'll see if maybe they got Boston, then they got Cleveland, then they got New Orleans, I think 3-game road trip. So we'll see if maybe they start coming back to earth and these panic about the tank and all that maybe sorts itself out a little bit. But Scotto, really appreciate it. Touched on a lot of stuff here. I think my listeners will really enjoy it, as they always do when you come on the show, man. So good talking to you, and I'm sure I'll see you at Barclays soon.
Always, brother. Anytime.
That does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. If you guys don't already, go check out my articles at ClutchPoints.com. I'm really putting up high volume, multiple articles per day, news, updates, injury analysis, all of that stuff's over there. Follow me on Twitter at Erik Slater _ live tweeting every game, interview clips, highlights, all that stuff. You'll find all that there. And as I said at the top, if you don't already, subscribe to this podcast on streaming platforms. Go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Like, comment, all that. Really appreciate you if you guys can do that. But Nets got a 3-game road trip coming up. They're kicking it off on Friday at TD Garden against the Boston Celtics. I'll be up there with more coverage of that, and I'll have all the coverage of the next stretch, which could be very determining for the Nets season. All that will be here on Believe in Nets. Talk to you guys soon.